Hello and welcome to the 19th in my series of presentations on the conflict between science and creationism. Today I'm going to be talking about the subject of populations, of population growth and genetic studies which help us to trace our evolutionary heritage. In particular, in this presentation I'll be looking at a number of claims made in the presentations of the infamous young Earth creationist Kent Hovind. This means that I won't be covering the whole topic, and I won't even be covering it in any sensible order. I'll just cover the sections that Hovind himself mentions. So let's get started. The human population on planet Earth is now over 7 billion individuals, that's 7,000 million. At the beginning of last century it was less than half of that value. If we trace current human population growth backwards, fitting the best mathematical models we can reasonably construct, then we get to a 0 point, sometime only a few thousand years ago, when the human population must have been very small indeed, approaching 0. Hovind's claim is that this shows that humanity cannot be tens or hundreds of thousands of years old, but can only be a few thousand years old. This is a case of extrapolating incorrectly from the observed data. The data show how rapidly human population is growing right now, but tracing that backwards is not a valid approach. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the exponential model of human population growth is only an approximation. Of course, there are highly disruptive events like the Black Death, for example, which killed off about a third of Europeans at the time in the 14th century. There are also wars, famines and natural disasters and so on. Secondly, the size of a population is limited primarily by the amount of resources available. Nomads in the deserts of the world have populations which do not grow exponentially because they only have a certain amount of food to share around, and their food production cannot scale with an increase of population. Modern farming methods allow us to maintain a rapidly growing world population, but this is only a relatively recent invention. Before the invention of agriculture in the last 10,000 years, most humans would have lived in small nomadic bands, able to provide only for themselves and a small family group. They would have lived from hunting and gathering rather than carefully rearing domesticated animals and planting seeds. The population size would have been limited by the quantity of food available, much as it is for other animals today, and hence it would have been rather stable, going up in times of great plenty and dropping in times of famine and drought. So the bottom line is that attempting to extrapolate models backwards without consideration for any other facts is, of course, invalid. Hovind talks a lot about the possibility of dinosaur-like creatures still living today in the modern world. He hypothesizes rogue individuals hiding out in remote swamps and lakes, somehow evading detection by the millions of people who live nearby and the thousands of scientists who spend their lives looking for such beasts. Long-term stable populations of creatures require a few hundred individuals in general. Tigers are an endangered species, and there are around 1,400 Bengal tigers still alive in the wild. An endangered species is in great danger of going extinct unless their population is controlled by a combination of conservation efforts and captive breeding. A population of 1,400 individuals, therefore, is considered highly endangered. So we can be fairly sure that there is no stable population of large creatures anywhere in the world, as it is utterly unthinkable that we could miss such a number of individuals. At the bottom of the oceans maybe, but certainly not on land. But there's another interesting point to be made here regarding Hovind's claim, that the myth of Noah's Ark is actually describing a real event. How did all of the species that we see in the world today survive from, depending on which account you believe, at most 7 individuals, and in some cases just 2 of each species? How did they survive the potentially catastrophic effects of inbreeding from such a limited number of individuals? And why is it that modern genetic studies show that there are vastly more genetic differences within any species of animal you choose to pick than could possibly be accounted for by a mere 4,500 years of breeding? Also, and it has to be said, but what did the carnivores eat for a whole year? Not just then, but also for the decades, even centuries afterwards, while the populations of prey species were recovering. Did they suddenly become vegetarian? Ask any vet and you'll find out that a cat fed on a vegetarian diet, without supplementation to replace the minerals that it lacks, will die. The fact that stable populations require hundreds or thousands of individuals to survive totally scuppers many of Hovind's ideas. And I haven't even mentioned the whole Adam and Eve idea. Though in fact, let's take a look at that now. Our cells, and those of all animals, contain components called mitochondria. These are essentially like tiny bacteria that actually live inside our cells and have their own DNA. They are passed down in the egg, i.e. only from the mother, so there is no crossover with paternal DNA to mess up the ordering of their genomes. In this case, you can trace differences in mitochondrial DNA with incredible accuracy and work out how long ago we all shared a common ancestor, when traced back through our female ancestors only. The figure turns out to be roughly 140,000 years ago. Note that this doesn't mean that this was the only woman alive at the time, nor does it mean that she was our last common ancestor. This latter is expected to have lived much more recently in the last 20,000 years, and probably more recently than that. It's very difficult to calculate. Also, it doesn't mean that this individual was the first human. Obviously, she had parents who had parents themselves, and so on. What the so-called mitochondrial Eve, admittedly an unfortunate term, tells us is that remarkably modern humans have been around for at least 140,000 years, or roughly 23 times longer than the Bible says. And that's a lower estimate. In reality, when investigated through other methods, our species has probably been around for more than twice this length of time. Is an endlessly increasing human population a good thing? Hovind makes it clear that he thinks that this is the case. I think he's claiming that we should colonise the entire world with human beings and build cities covering every inch of habitable land. I don't think you have to be an expert to see why this is a bad idea. Hovind believes in the evangelical concept of the rapture, where the souls of the faithful few will soon be raised up into heaven, leaving the rest of us down here to wither away and die. People have been waiting for this event for thousands of years, since before the time of the New Testament even, with no luck as far as I'm aware. But the problem with this belief, apart from the fact that there's no evidence for it, is that it encourages a very short-term viewpoint. It encourages believers not to care about the future. Except for themselves, of course. But those of us who advocate science and humanism have a strong obligation to care for the Earth that we have, because we don't see any evidence that it will be miraculously renovated at any point in the future. A high human population is a problem in many ways, especially as the entire world attempts to lift themselves to first world standards of living. There is not enough space on the Earth to provide the food, drink and fuel for all the people alive today at the same standards of the average American. And it's obviously supremely unfair of us to expect other countries to remain impoverished just so that we can continue to live lives of opulence and plenty. One of the greatest challenges facing humanity in the 21st century is the growth of the human population, expected to peak at somewhere over 9 billion individuals in the middle of the century, before dropping back down again. This much seems almost inevitable, barring major disasters or disease epidemics, but we have other problems with population control too, as a population with fewer children will suffer the economic consequences of a reduced workforce compared to the dependent elderly. So there is no easy answer to this problem. All we can sensibly do is to educate as many people as possible and bring as many nations to first world prosperity as quickly as possible. This may seem counterintuitive, but the two best ways to reduce population growth are to give better rights to women, and hence to allow them to pursue careers instead of being forced to rear huge families, and also to decrease child mortality and hence reduce the overcompensation of large families. And then all we can do is to focus on the incredible solutions that science has developed and is developing, which will allow us to mitigate the challenges that I've outlined on this slide. Well, that's all for now. As ever, there's loads more information on my website at frame.net, where you can also find a transcript of this talk and all the following ones and all the previous ones. And you can keep up to date with my blog as well as learning about some of my other work. See you next time when I'll be talking about health and disease and investigating some of the creationist claims in this area. Thanks for listening.